A 2-week-old German Shepherd puppy crawled from the wet grass beneath a Vermont farm fence, trembling toward a young FBI agent. He was too weak to stand, yet still reached for her boot. Around his tiny neck was a blue cloth marked with 2 hidden words. Hollow root. If you believe God guides the forgotten toward help, leave Amen. I was 24 years old when Maple Hollow first taught me that beautiful towns can keep the saddest secrets. From the highway, the place looked like something painted on the lid of an old cookie tin. White church steeple, red barns, maple trees burning gold along the hills, and morning fog folded low across the fields like a quilt someone had forgotten to lift. I had been with the Bureau long enough to own a badge, but not long enough to stop feeling the weight of it against my ribs. My senior agent, Daniel Mercer, sat beside me in the passenger seat of our dark sedan, his square jaw shadowed with gray stubble, his broad shoulders filling his navy coat like he had been carved for bad weather. Mercer was in his late 40s, a calm man with tired hazel eyes and the patient voice of someone who had seen panic rise and fall many times. He did not talk much on the drive. He only looked over the case notes and said, "Small towns remember kindness. They also remember who arrives with questions." Willow Grace Farm stood at the edge of town, bright even under the fog. It had a white fence, a weathered green barn, and a small wooden sign painted with sunflowers. The farm served as a therapy place for seniors, grieving families, and anyone who needed quiet company more than advice. Its owner, Eleanor Price, met us near the gate. She was 67, slender but sturdy in the way farm women often are, with silver hair pinned into a low bun, pale skin lined by sun and worry, and a cream wool sweater tucked into old work pants. Mud clung to her brown boots. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the kind of sorrow that has nowhere polite to sit. "They took some tools," she said, trying to sound practical. "A battery pack, 2 repair kits, nothing that matters much." Then her voice thinned. "But Mabel, she has not been herself." Mabel was the farm's miniature therapy horse, a soft chestnut mare with a cream-colored mane and gentle brown eyes. Eleanor said the seniors called her the little nurse with hooves, because Mabel had a habit of resting her head against anyone who was lonely, as if she could hear aches that people were too proud to name. That morning, Mabel stood in the corner of her stall with her head lowered, her small body tense, her spirit faded to a fragile hush. She did not step toward Eleanor. She did not nudge my hand. She only watched the barn door with eyes that seemed to ask why the world had changed overnight. I had walked into homes after robberies before. I had seen drawers pulled open, jewelry boxes emptied, photographs knocked crooked on walls. But there was something different about a quiet animal that no longer trusted the sound of footsteps. It reached past my training and found the part of me I kept hidden. My father had raised me to be steady. "A law officer does not cry at a scene," he used to say. So I stood still. I took notes. I looked at the fence, the ground, the tool shed, and the narrow dirt road behind the barn. I did everything a young agent was supposed to do while my heart stood beside Mabel and wished it had hands gentle enough to explain. The local deputy, Tom Harlan, a round-faced man in his early 50s with sandy hair and a coffee stain on his uniform sleeve, believed it was a simple farm break-in. He was not careless, only familiar with ordinary trouble. "Kids, maybe," he said, "or someone looking for quick cash." Mercer gave me a glance that meant, listen first, argue later. So I listened. But the scene did not feel clumsy. The back fence had been opened in one clean section. The tool shed had not been tossed wildly. Whoever entered seemed to know which lock was weak, where the small equipment was stored, and which side of the property had no working camera. On a lower rail of the fence, I found a dark smear of machine oil. In the wet earth below it, half buried in mud, was a small yellow piece of plastic, like the torn corner of a shipping label. Then Mabel flinched. It was only the low rumble of a delivery truck passing on the distant road, but the little horse jerked back as if the sound had reached into the stall and touched a memory. Eleanor covered her mouth. Mercer stopped writing. Even Deputy Harlan went quiet. The fog outside shifted in pale strips through the barn boards, and for a few seconds, no one moved. A thin cry slipped through the morning air, so small it almost vanished beneath the truck's fading engine. It was not a bird, it was not the creak of the barn. It was a living sound, weak and trembling, and it made the whole farm seem to hold its breath. I followed it past the rear fence, through damp grass silvered by fog, toward a cluster of brush near the tree line. The sound came again, softer this time. Beneath a low maple branch sat an old wooden basket, half hidden by weeds and straw. A dirty blue towel had been folded over the top, as if someone had tried to hide what they no longer wanted to carry. When I lifted the towel, I forgot every careful sentence I had prepared for that morning. Inside was a German shepherd puppy, no more than 2 weeks old. His sable coat was soft and uneven, dark along the back, lighter around the tiny muzzle. His ears were folded like little leaves. His body shook in small, uneven waves. He was too young to stand, too weak to crawl out, and so small that my 2 hands could have held most of his world. His eyes had only begun to open, cloudy and innocent, but they turned toward me with a terrible trust. He did not bark. He barely made a sound. He simply looked at me as if asking the oldest question any frightened creature can ask. Please do not leave me here. I gathered him into my coat. The towel slipped from the basket, and as it unfolded, mud cracked along the stitched edge. There, beneath the dirt, were faint printed words. Hollow Root Delivery. I looked at Mercer. He saw it too. His expression changed. Not much, but enough. The simple farm break-in had just grown a longer shadow. Eleanor whispered, "Who would leave a baby out here?" No one answered. There are questions so sorrowful that even the law needs a moment before it can speak. I told Deputy Harlan to preserve the basket and towel, then asked Mercer for the nearest emergency veterinarian. Procedure mattered, evidence mattered, but that puppy was not an object in a report. He was warm, fading, and breathing against my palm. As we drove into town, I kept him tucked inside my coat, feeling each tiny breath like a match flame cupped against the wind. For the first time that day, I stopped thinking about stolen tools. I thought about someone crossing a line that no decent soul should cross. I thought about Mabel's fearful eyes, the oil on the fence, the yellow plastic in the mud, and the blue towel marked with a company name that was supposed to deliver help. At the Maple Hollow Animal Clinic, Dr. Lila Monroe took him from me with practiced tenderness. She was a tall black woman in her late 30s, with close-cropped curls, warm brown eyes, and a voice gentle enough to calm a room before medicine did. Her green scrubs were dusted with animal hair, and a silver paw-print necklace rested at her collar. She examined the puppy under a warming lamp, her face serious but kind. "He is very young," she said. "Too young to be away from his mother, too weak to make promises about tonight." I sat in the hallway after that, my hands smelling of straw, machine oil, and the faint milk-sweet scent from the towel. Mercer stood nearby, silent as a church bell before Sunday. Through the glass door, I could see the puppy under the golden lamp, smaller than any case file, smaller than any law written to protect him. Dr. Monroe stepped out with a clipboard. "Do you want to put a temporary name on the intake form?" I looked at the line where a name should be. I thought about giving him one. I wanted to, but fear held my throat closed. Naming a life means admitting you hope it will stay. "Little one," I said at last, because before dawn I did not yet know if he would survive, and I was not brave enough to name a soul I was already afraid to lose. 3 days after Willow Grace Farm, Maple Hollow tried to put its pretty face back on. The church bell rang at noon. The bakery opened its striped awning. Children's bicycles leaned against white fences, and the maple leaves kept falling in slow golden spirals as if heaven itself had not received the report. But I had learned something in those 3 days. A town can smile, while fear moves quietly through its backyards. The puppy was still alive, though Dr. Lila Monroe refused to call that a victory yet. He slept most of the time inside a small warming crate at the Maple Hollow Animal Clinic, wrapped in a fresh towel that smelled faintly of soap and powdered milk. He was still only a tiny sable German shepherd, his folded ears pressed close to his head, his breathing thin but stubborn. I visited before sunrise and after interviews, telling myself it was only because he was connected to evidence. That was the kind of lie young agents tell when their hearts begin working without permission. The call about the Bell House came in just after 2 in the afternoon. Daniel Mercer and I arrived on Orchard Lane, 10 minutes behind the local deputies. The Bell home looked like the sort of place where nothing sharp should ever happen. A pale yellow cottage with blue shutters, a white picket fence, a small apple tree bending over the side yard, and wind chimes on the porch singing in the cold air. Family photographs lined the hallway inside, the kind with Christmas sweaters, fishing trips, graduations, and the same 2 older people smiling at every stage of somebody else's growing life. Arthur Bell stood near the kitchen table, 76 years old, tall and stooped, with careful silver hair, a narrow face, and the quiet dignity of a man who had spent most of his life fixing things before they became problems. He wore a brown cardigan buttoned wrong at the top, as if his fingers had forgotten their duties after the shock. His wife, June Bell, was 73, short and round-cheeked, with soft white curls, rosy skin, and eyes that looked kind even when filled with tears. She held a dish towel in both hands and twisted it again and again, not to clean anything, but because grief gives the hands useless work. "We were at my appointment," June said. "Arthur's hip has been troubling him, so we made a whole afternoon of it. Doctor first, then soup at Miller's Diner." She tried to smile. "He always says soup outside the house tastes more expensive because someone else washed the pot." Arthur gave a faint laugh, but it broke quickly. The rear window had been forced open, not broken wildly, not shattered by panic, but lifted with steady patience. In the living room, drawers had been pulled out, cushions turned over, and a small oak box had been emptied on the rug. A wallet was gone, along with a few pieces of jewelry and an old game console Arthur said belonged to their grandson. None of it was fortune-making. All of it was easy to carry, easy to sell, and painful enough to make a home feel less like a home. Then I saw Harbor. He lay in the hallway between the living room and bedroom, an old Labrador mix with a graying muzzle, honey-colored fur, and one white paw tucked beneath him as if he had simply grown tired during a long watch. He was 12, June told me, though his eyes still had that loyal brightness older dogs keep when the body begins making quieter agreements with time. He lifted his head when June knelt beside him, and his tail moved once against the floor. It was the smallest greeting I had ever seen, and somehow one of the bravest. "He tried to stop him," Arthur said, his voice rough. "Old boy could barely climb the porch steps some days, but he still tried." I looked at Harbor, then at the rear window, then at the muddy track near the back door. Something about the scene tightened around me. Willow Grace Farm had been a place for seniors and wounded spirits. This house belonged to an elderly couple who trusted routine, neighbors, and the sound of their own dog breathing at night. In both places, the intruder had chosen the softest door, not the richest, the softest. Deputy Tom Harlan joined us in the kitchen, his face heavier than it had been at the farm. "Could still be local," he said, though he did not sound convinced anymore. "Someone watching houses." "Someone who knows schedules," Mercer said. I crouched near the back threshold. There was mud pressed into the wood grain, and inside the mud a dark oily sheen caught the light. It had the same sour metal smell I remembered from the fence at Willow Grace. Beside the step, half hidden under a fallen leaf, a tiny yellow fragment of plastic rested against the wall. I did not touch it. I only looked long enough to feel the invisible thread pull tighter. At the clinic later that afternoon, Dr. Monroe met me in the examination room with the blue towel sealed in an evidence bag. Her expression had changed from concern to unease. "I know you asked me not to disturb anything beyond medical need," she said, "but when we warmed the towel and dried the mud along the edge, I noticed something." She set the bag beneath a magnifying lamp. The room smelled of antiseptic, warm milk, and the cedar shavings from a nearby rabbit cage. The puppy slept in the next room, a little mound beneath soft cloth, fighting his quiet battle one breath at a time. The lamp clicked on with a sharp white flash, and the stitched edge of the blue towel suddenly glowed under the glass. For one breath, the room went silent except for the faint hum of electricity. Then I saw it. 4 small characters hidden in the seam. HRD-17. It was not a clothing label, not a brand mark. It looked like a sorting code, the kind placed on delivery cloths, storage wraps, or internal cargo. Dr. Monroe pointed to a second finding. A tiny thread of dark blue fabric snagged in the towel stitching, thicker than ordinary cotton, almost like uniform material. There was also fine wood dust caught in the fibers, not barn dust, but smoother, drier, like the dust from stacked crates or warehouse shelving. And under the towel fold, she had found another small yellow plastic scrap, matching the kind from Willow Grace, and now, likely, the Bell House. I called Mercer from the hallway. "Hollow root delivery," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "The senior assistance company?" "Yes." "That name keeps showing up in places it should not." When I returned to the Bell House, June remembered them immediately. Hollow Route had delivered a small heater the week before, part of a winter support program for seniors. "Such a polite young man," she said. "Blue jacket, dark cap, rough hands. He even bent down and talked to Harbor." She looked toward the hallway where Harbor had been carried out for emergency care. Harbor liked most people, but now that I think of it, he backed away when that man reached for his collar. Arthur frowned. I thought he was just tired. So did everyone, I thought. That was how men with friendly logos entered lives. They came carrying heaters, groceries, donated blankets. They learned where the spare key was. They learned which dog was old, which camera was broken, which couple left every Thursday for appointments. A thief with a crowbar was frightening. A thief with a clipboard was worse. By evening, I had 2 photographs pinned side by side on the conference board at the sheriff's office. The cut fence at Willow Grace Farm and the forced rear window at the Bell House. 2 different places, 2 different animals, the same machine oil, the same yellow plastic, the same connection to hollow root delivery, the same feeling that someone had been welcomed close before they came back in the dark. I went to the clinic before heading to the motel. The building was nearly quiet, washed in the soft yellow light that makes every animal hospital feel like a chapel for small miracles. Dr. Monroe had Harbor stabilized in the back. The old dog had a chance, she said, but his recovery would be slow. Then she led me to the warming crate. The puppy was still there, impossibly small beneath the glow. I placed one finger against the edge of the crate. He stirred, weakly, and turned his tiny muzzle toward me. He could not know my badge, my name, or the trouble gathering around him. But somehow, in that fragile movement, I felt the case change shape again. "Hold on, little one," I whispered. "I think you came from the same darkness I'm trying to find." And for the first time since Willow Grace Farm, his breathing sounded just a little steadier. By the 4th morning in Maple Hollow, I understood why people trusted hollow root delivery. Their blue vans moved through town like friendly beetles, stopping at white porches, church basements, senior cottages, and farm gates with the easy rhythm of habit. Their logo was painted in cheerful yellow letters beneath a little North Star. Beneath it was the slogan, "We bring help home." It was the sort of phrase that could make an elderly widow open her door before checking the peephole. Their office sat beside a feed store on Mill Road in a renovated brick building with flower boxes under the windows and a donation bin near the entrance. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, cardboard, and lemon cleaner. A bulletin board displayed photos of smiling seniors holding grocery bags, heaters, blankets, and little boxes tied with ribbon. If evil ever wanted a Sunday coat, I thought, it might borrow one from a place like this. Caleb Voss came out to greet us before the receptionist finished calling his name. He was 42, tall and lean, with neat dark hair combed back from a broad forehead and a carefully trimmed beard that sharpened his jaw. His eyes were blue-gray, calm in the practiced way of men who know exactly how long to hold another person's gaze. He wore a dark blue hollow root jacket, zipped halfway over a white shirt, work boots polished enough for photographs but scuffed enough to look humble. His handshake was warm, his smile was warmer. It never reached the deeper rooms of his face. "Agents," Caleb said, "anything Hollow Root can do to help, you have it. Maple Hollow takes care of its own." Daniel Mercer stood beside me, quiet and watchful, letting me ask the first questions. I was young enough that some men mistook my manners for uncertainty. Caleb did. I could feel it in the way he angled his answers toward Mercer even when I was the one speaking. "We understand your company delivered supplies to Willow Grace Farm 2 weeks ago," I said. Caleb nodded. "Repair brackets for the west stall. Eleanor Price is a treasure. We try to support her work whenever we can." "And the Bell residence?" "A small heater, part of our Helping Hands for Seniors program." He gestured toward the photos on the wall. "A lot of folks here are on fixed incomes. Winter does not ask permission before arriving." He said it beautifully, almost too beautifully. That was the first thing I noticed about Caleb Voss. Every sentence seemed ready to be quoted by the town paper. He led us to a small conference room where his operations manager printed delivery records. Her name was Marcy Vale, a thin woman in her early 30s with pale blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, nervous hands, and the wary politeness of someone who had learned to survive by being useful. She avoided Caleb's eyes when he thanked her. That small avoidance stayed with me. The records were clean at first glance: delivery dates, driver initials, item numbers, customer signatures. But in the secondary notes field, the warmth of Hollow Root began to cool. For Willow Grace Farm, rear gate sticks, back camera unreliable, animal on property, owner alone after dusk. For the Bell residence, older couple away for clinic visits, dog friendly but slow, rear window accessible from orchard side. I read the lines twice, then a third time. Caleb leaned back in his chair, fingers folded loosely. "Safety notes," he said before I asked. "We tell our drivers what to expect. Loose animals, bad gates, icy steps. It helps avoid accidents." "Does knowing a rear camera is unreliable help avoid accidents?" I asked. His smile did not move. "It helps our drivers know where not to leave packages." Mercer glanced at me, and I knew he had seen it too. The notes were not only about delivery, they were a map of weakness, written in the language of service. Back at the sheriff's office, I began pulling earlier reports from Maple Hollow and the neighboring counties. Small thefts, missing tools, jewelry boxes emptied, old electronics taken. Nothing large enough to make headlines, nothing strange enough to stand alone. But several addresses had used Hollow Root within a month of the incident. Several victims were elderly. Several had pets noted in delivery records. Then I found North Star Finds. It was an online resale account with listings across Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Used repair kits, vintage brooches, a fishing reel, a game console matching Arthur Bell's description. The photos were careless in the way thieves sometimes are when they trust the world not to look closely. In one listing, a small oak jewelry box sat on a blue metal shelf. I enlarged the image. The reflection on the polished lid was faint, warped by scratches and light. The computer fan whirred louder, and the screen flickered once, turning the tiny reflection silver. For one heartbeat, the room seemed to narrow around that single shine. Then I saw it. Behind the shelf, blurred but unmistakable, the curved handle of an old wooden basket, the same shape as the one that had held the puppy. I called Mercer over. He bent close, his gray stubble catching the desk lamp. "That does not get us inside a warehouse," he said. "No," I replied, "but it tells us the basket was not born in a pasture." The name Nolan Briggs came from driver logs and old arrest records. He was 29, a seasonal worker with a history of poor choices, but no reputation for cruelty. His booking photo showed a narrow-faced man with tired brown eyes, patchy beard growth along his chin, and hair that curled unevenly under a work cap. People described him as jumpy, eager to please, and often broke. Caleb had hired him through a second-chance employment program, then praised him publicly during a church fundraiser. To the town, Caleb had rescued Nolan. To me, it looked possible that Caleb had purchased obedience with gratitude. That afternoon, Dr. Monroe called. Her voice was softer than usual. "He made it through another feeding." I drove to the clinic before I meant to. The puppy was still impossibly small beneath the warming light, but he had begun to root blindly toward the bottle when Dr. Monroe touched his cheek. His sable fur looked cleaner now, dark along his little spine and tawny at the muzzle. His folded ears made him look older than a newborn and younger than hope. I stood with my hand against the crate, ashamed of how badly I wanted him to live. "He needs a real name eventually," Dr. Monroe said. I looked at him, at the tiny body trying to survive a world that had already asked too much. I thought of maps, burdens, roads, and the North Star on Hollow Roots vans. Then I thought of a different name, one that felt small enough to whisper and strong enough to grow into. "Rin," I said. Dr. Monroe smiled. "Rin?" "Rin," I repeated. "For now, that is all he has to carry." That evening, Mercer and I requested a warrant to search Hollow Roots auxiliary storage records, especially anything tied to HRD 17. The judge wanted more. A reflection in a listing photo, coded notes, similar fragments, and a frightened puppy were not enough to open every door Caleb Voss owned. Not yet. So we waited, and waiting is the part of justice nobody puts in stories. It tastes like stale coffee and feels like standing outside a locked room while something inside keeps breathing. Near closing time, Caleb Voss walked into the sheriff's office carrying a cardboard tray of coffee cups. He greeted Deputy Harlan by name, asked after June Bell, and set the cups on the front desk like a man delivering comfort. "Hard days," he said gently. "Figured everyone could use something warm." Then he saw my desk. 2 photographs lay there, the basket from Willow Grace and the enlarged reflection from North Star Finds. Caleb's eyes touched the basket, and his smile paused for less than a second. Less than a blink. Less than most people would notice. But I noticed, because by then I had named the puppy Rin. And once a life has a name, even the smallest pause can sound like a confession. By the next morning, Maple Hollow had chosen a side, and it was not mine. Small towns do not always defend the innocent first. Sometimes they defend the familiar. Caleb Voss had fixed too many porch rails, delivered too many heaters, paid too many quiet bills, and smiled in too many church basements for people to believe a young federal agent with tired eyes and a motel key could understand him better than they did. At Miller's Diner, conversations lowered when I walked in. At the gas station, a man in a red flannel jacket told Mercer that outsiders loved turning good men into villains because it made their reports look important. He said it loudly enough for me to hear, then looked away, like courage had finished its shift. Mercer did not scold me. That was not his way. He only leaned against our sedan outside the sheriff's office, arms folded over his coat, his gray stubbled face turned toward the hills. "You may be right," he said, "but right without proof is just a storm-making noise. Caleb has half this town wrapped around his good deeds. We need something that stands up after the sympathy fades." I knew he was not doubting me. He was warning me. There is a difference, but at 24, the difference still stung. Caleb's kindness had roots everywhere. He had donated a van for senior rides after a winter accident left 3 elderly residents stranded during a storm. He had repaired the community center roof after a spring thaw split the old shingles. He had once paid a veterinary bill for a widower's cat, and people repeated that story like scripture with a receipt attached. In Maple Hollow, Caleb was not merely a businessman. He was a neighbor with a halo made of invoices nobody wanted to question. That afternoon, I went back to the Maple Hollow Animal Clinic. I told myself I was checking on evidence. I told myself many things that were only half true. Harbor was awake in a recovery room, lying on a thick plaid blanket that June Bell had brought from home. The old Labrador mix looked smaller outside his hallway, as if the house had been part of his body and he had left some of himself behind. His honey-colored fur had been brushed clean, his graying muzzle rested on one paw, and his eyes followed June with a soft devotion that made my throat tighten. June sat beside him in a green chair, knitting something uneven and blue. "He used to greet everyone," she said. "Mailmen, neighbors, even that squirrel who steals pears like he pays taxes." She tried to laugh, and Harbor's tail shifted once, polite as an old gentleman tipping his hat. Now he listens before he trusts the door. Across the hall, Rin slept beneath the warming light. 2 lives at opposite ends of the world. One old dog who had spent his strength protecting a home, and one newborn soul abandoned before he had even learned what home meant. I stood between those rooms and felt the case change inside me. This was not only about stolen objects. It was about people who loved quietly, animals who guarded faithfully, and someone who had learned to use that love as a weakness. Dr. Lila Monroe found me by the supply counter, holding the wooden basket in gloved hands. "Jessica," she said, and my first name sounded serious in her voice. "You need to see this." She had cleaned the basket only where preservation allowed, working with the evidence technician to photograph each layer before touching it. Under dried straw and gray dust, a faint black stamp had appeared along the bottom slat. HRD-17/Annex Storage. Wedged inside a crack was a tiny strip of paper, brittle and stained, with 2 printed words still readable. Annex B. The dust was not ordinary barn dirt. It was fine, dry, and gray, like the powder that collects on old shelves and cardboard pallets in forgotten storage rooms. "Could it be from Hollow Route's main warehouse?" I asked. Dr. Monroe shook her head. "I cannot prove where it came from, but this is not pasture dust, and the straw caught in the handle is mixed with packing fiber." She looked through the glass toward Rin. "That baby did not crawl into a basket by himself." No, I thought. Someone placed him there. Someone carried him until he became inconvenient. A metal tray slipped in the next room and struck the tile with a bright ringing crash. Harbor startled on his blanket. Rin gave one tiny cry under the golden lamp. For a second the clinic froze in that shared sound. Old fear, newborn fear, and my own heart answering both before my badge could stop it. That was the moment I decided I would not let Caleb's good reputation become a locked door. The name Mara Keene came from a former payroll file Mercer found after widening our review. She had left Hollow Route 9 months earlier without giving a public reason. We met her that evening at the back booth of Miller's Diner, far from the windows. Mara was 51, broad-shouldered and tall, with iron-gray hair cut blunt at her jaw, weathered skin, and deep-set green eyes that seemed to measure every exit before trusting any chair. She wore a denim jacket over a black sweater, no jewelry except a thin silver ring on her thumb. Her voice was low and rough, the voice of a woman who had smoked once, quit twice, and learned to keep secrets because secrets had weight. "I did not leave because of a scheduling dispute," Mara said, stirring coffee she never drank. "I left because Caleb started turning kindness into inventory." She told us about the internal list, not an official file, not labeled for crime, of course. Caleb called it delivery intelligence, a phrase clean enough to survive a meeting. Drivers recorded who lived alone, which doors stuck, which pets barked, who kept spare keys in planters, who attended church on Wednesday evenings, and whose cameras had not worked since last winter. Mara had objected. Caleb smiled and told her seniors needed special care. Nolan Briggs, she said, was the one Caleb sent after hours in the unmarked utility van. "Why come forward now?" Mercer asked. Mara looked at me then, and for the first time her hard face softened. "Because I heard about the puppy." She swallowed. A company can steal a lot before decent people admit what they saw, but a 2-week-old dog left in the cold? That cuts through excuses. From inside her jacket, she removed a folded photocopy, creased white at the edges. I kept one page, thought maybe one day I would stop being afraid of it. She placed it on the table. At the top, in Caleb's neat block letters, were the words, "Quiet Doors." Beneath them were addresses, notes, dates, symbols. Some had checks. Some had stars. Some had small circles. Mara tapped one circled address, and the paper made a dry whisper beneath her nail. I looked down. The next target was not a wealthy home. It was Willow Grace Farm. Beside it, written in careful ink, were 5 words. "Return Friday. No cameras after 6. For a moment, the diner noise vanished. No plates, no coffee, no old men laughing near the counter. Only those words, waiting on the page like a porch light left on for the wrong visitor. Friday was tomorrow. By nightfall, Mercer, Deputy Harlan, and I had begun drafting a legal surveillance plan. We still needed the warrant to be stronger, but if someone returned to Willow Grace Farm, we could be ready. Eleanor Price agreed to leave the property under the cover of visiting a cousin, though her face paled when I told her why. "Mabel just started eating again," she whispered. "Please do not let them come near her." I promised carefully, because promises made near frightened animals should never be decorated. "We will do everything the law allows." Before heading out, I stopped once more at the clinic. Rin lay wrapped in a clean towel, smaller than the name I had given him. He did not know me. He did not know Hollowroot, Caleb Voss, Willow Grace, or the list that had turned kindness into a hunting map. He only knew warmth, hunger, sleep, and the fragile rhythm of surviving another hour. "I will come back," I whispered. His tiny paw moved beneath the towel, no bigger than a folded leaf. It touched the fabric once, then stilled. It was not strength, not yet, but it felt like trust trying to become real, and that was enough to send me back into the dark. Friday evening came to Willow Grace Farm wearing a soft face. The sky above Maple Hollow turned lavender, the maple trees along the hill glowed like lanterns, and the barn windows caught the last light in small squares of gold. If someone had driven past on the main road, they would have seen only a quiet therapy farm settling into dusk. That was the point. Eleanor Price had been taken to her cousin's house under the gentle excuse of needing rest. Mabel remained in the barn under veterinary supervision, watched from a safe distance by Deputy Tom Harlan and 2 officers tucked into the shadow of the equipment shed. Daniel Mercer and I waited farther back near the tree line, inside a dark SUV with the lights off and the recording equipment running. I had left Rin at the clinic. That decision should have been simple. He was 2 weeks old, still fighting for warmth and milk, still too small to belong anywhere except beneath a careful lamp and a doctor's hands. Yet, as the farm darkened, I kept thinking of his tiny paw moving beneath the towel when I promised to return. Some cases enter the mind through evidence. This one had entered through the palm of my hand. Mercer sat beside me, still as stone, binoculars resting against his chest. His calm did not comfort me so much as remind me how new I was to waiting. "Breathe," he said without looking over. "I am breathing." "Then stop doing it, like you are arguing with the air." Despite myself, I almost smiled. Mercer had a way of making fear sound like a paperwork issue. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus. The barn smelled faintly of hay and wet wood. Somewhere inside, Mabel shifted in her stall, and the soft scrape of hoof on straw carried through the open yard. It was an ordinary sound, but after what had happened there, ordinary felt holy. At 7:18 p.m., the unmarked utility van appeared on the dirt road behind the farm. No logo, no friendly North Star. Just dull gray paint, one dim headlight, and the uneven cough of an engine that seemed to dislike being awake. The van rolled behind the barn and stopped near the same section of fence that had been opened before. The driver stepped out wearing a dark cap and a blue jacket with the logo removed, but the shape of him matched the file photograph. Nolan Briggs was thinner in person than in his record, with a narrow face, uneven brown curls under the cap, and a patchy beard that made him look younger and more worn at the same time. His movements were quick, nervous, almost apologetic, as if every shadow had the right to question him. He carried a canvas backpack with one corner sagging strangely at the bottom. In one gloved hand, he held a cutting tool. He did not search for a way in. He went directly to the weak section of fence, opened it with practiced care, and slipped through. "He knows the path," I whispered. Mercer touched the recorder button. And now the recorder knows he knows. Nolan moved to the rear of the equipment shed, knelt by a stack of old feed barrels, and began feeling underneath them. He was not gathering tools. He was looking for something hidden. After a minute, he pulled out a small metal box wrapped in plastic. He opened it just enough for the camera lens to catch the edge of memory cards, a narrow notebook, and a roll of yellow shipping labels marked with faint block letters. HRD. My pulse beat hard once, then steadied. There it was. Not the whole case, but a living piece of it. A sudden white beam swept across the barn wall, headlights from a second vehicle cutting through the dusk. Nolan froze with the metal box in his hand. The crickets seemed to vanish mid-song, and for one breath the whole farm stood between guilt and revelation. The second vehicle was Caleb Voss's blue pickup. Not the company van, not the public smile on wheels, but his own truck, clean and dark, pulling into the yard as if he had every right to arrive. Caleb stepped out wearing his familiar hollow root jacket, the North Star logo bright even in the low light. His beard was perfectly trimmed. His posture was calm. He looked less like a man entering a crime scene than a pastor arriving late to bless it. "Nolan," he said, low but clear through our directional microphone, "please tell me you found it." Nolan's shoulders folded inward. "I found the box. I was going to bring it." "You were supposed to bring it 3 nights ago." "I could not. They came too fast after the farm, and the little one was making noise. I panicked." My hand tightened around the edge of the seat. Caleb's face did not change, but his voice sharpened. "You should never have left the little one there. That basket had rooting marks." There are moments in an investigation when suspicion becomes shape, not yet justice. Not yet a verdict, but shape. Caleb had said what he should not have known. He had placed himself inside the story of Ryn. "Give me the memory cards," Caleb said, "and the address list. All of it." Mercer spoke into his radio. "Move." The yard lit up in controlled bursts. Flashlights, vehicle lamps, officers stepping from cover. Deputy Harlan's voice rang out, firmer than I had ever heard it. "Federal agents and sheriff's office, hands visible." Nolan dropped the metal box as if it had burned him. Caleb turned slowly, his expression wounded, almost disappointed, as though we had interrupted charity itself. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "I received word Nolan had taken a company vehicle without permission. I came to help." I stepped toward him, the recorder still running in my pocket. "You came to collect memory cards and an address list." His eyes moved to mine. For the first time, the warmth was gone. "Agent Ward, you are very young. And you are very recorded." Nolan broke first, not loudly, not dramatically. His knees seemed to lose faith in the rest of him. "He told me which houses," Nolan said, voice shaking. "He said they were easy jobs. No one would miss old junk. He said the animals would make noise, so I had to be quick." He looked toward the barn, then down at the ground. "I did not mean for it to go that far." Caleb said nothing then. Silence was the only honest thing he had offered all week. Inside Nolan's backpack, officers found the hidden lining Mara had warned us about. Tucked behind the torn seam were 2 memory cards, a folded page from the Quiet Doors list, and several yellow HRD labels. In the van were tools, gloves, and packaging materials dusted with the same gray powder found on Rin's basket. Each item was placed, photographed, sealed. Evidence has its own slow ceremony. It does not shout. It simply remains. As Caleb was led toward the patrol vehicle, he passed close enough that I could smell his cologne beneath the barn air, clean and expensive, trying even then to cover the sourness of what he had done. Caleb leaned near me and whispered, "You should have left that puppy where you found it." His words landed softer than falling dust, but the space around them went cold. I did not answer. I did not need to. He had just closed the last door he had been hiding behind. It was nearly midnight when I reached the clinic. Dr. Monroe met me in the hall, tired but smiling. "Rin took a little more milk," she said. "His temperature is holding better." I sat beside the warming crate, too exhausted to speak. Rin lay wrapped beneath the golden light, still smaller than the world, still breathing as if each breath had to be negotiated. Then his young eyes opened, cloudy and tender, and turned toward me. This time the look did not feel only like a plea. It felt like a question. "Are we safe now?" I placed my hand against the clear wall of the crate. "Not yet," I whispered, "but we are closer." And in that small room, after a night of shadows, closer felt like grace. The morning after Caleb Voss was taken into custody, Maple Hollow woke up looking embarrassed. The church steeple was still white, the maple leaves still bright, and the bakery still opened on time, but the town moved differently. People crossed sidewalks more slowly. Neighbors lowered their voices when Hollow Root's blue vans were towed from the office lot. Goodness, when misused, leaves a strange bruise on a community. It does not only hurt the people who were targeted, it makes everyone wonder which smiles they should have questioned sooner. Annex B sat 5 miles outside town, behind an abandoned lumber yard where weeds grew through cracked gravel and old pallets leaned like tired bones against a chain-link fence. It was not listed on Hollow Root's public records. It had no cheerful sign, no flower boxes, no slogan promising help. Just a low metal building with a rusted side door and gray dust gathered thick along the windows. When the search team opened it, the smell of cardboard, machine oil, old straw, and damp wood rolled out into the cold air. Inside, the truth waited without ceremony. On one shelf, deputies found tool kits from Willow Grace Farm, Arthur Bell's old game console, and June's small jewelry box wrapped in packing paper. On another were shipping labels marked HRD-17, altered delivery logs, and printed order sheets connected to the North Star Finds resale account. In the back corner, near a stack of broken crates, we found old towels, pet carriers, food bowls, and a shallow wooden basket with the same cut of handle as the one that had held Rin. I stood there for a long moment, looking at that corner. It was small, almost hidden, but grief does not need much room to leave its mark. Mercer moved beside me, his expression hard. "This is enough to tie the storage site to the farm, the Bell house, and the resale account." "It ties Rin here too," I said. He nodded. He did not soften his voice. Men like Mercer showed kindness by not looking away. Nolan Briggs gave more details after the search. He claimed someone had left a small litter near the storage site weeks earlier, and he had brought the puppies inside because he did not know what else to do. I never fully knew how much of that was truth, and how much was a man trying to make his own reflection easier to face. What we could prove was simpler. Rin had been held at Annex B, placed in a marked basket, and abandoned near Willow Grace Farm when Nolan panicked after returning to hide evidence. Because Rin was too weak, he had become a burden to people who measured life by convenience. The charges grew from there. Organized break-ins, stolen property moved through online sales, misuse of senior assistance records, concealment of evidence, a pattern of targeting homes and farms where older residents, therapy animals, or household pets made easy trust look like easy access. Nolan's attorney tried to frame everything involving the animals as panic, poor judgment, and fear in the moment. But the evidence told a colder story. Nolan had carried tools. Caleb had recorded which homes had animals. The quiet doors list named pets the way it named weak locks and broken cameras. Those animals were not surprises. They were obstacles that Caleb and Nolan had already counted. I helped the prosecutors build that chain, link by link. I was still young enough to think truth should glow when placed on a table. It does not. Truth must be labeled, dated, witnessed, and made strong enough to survive people who profit from confusion. The law is not a lightning strike. It is a lantern carried through fog, one careful step at a time. In the weeks that followed, Maple Hollow began the slow work of repairing more than fences. The senior center changed how outside vendors received personal information. Therapy farms across the county added cameras, stronger gates, and volunteer check-in systems. Hollow Roots donation photos came down from bulletin boards, and Caleb's name stopped being spoken with certainty. It was spoken, when spoken at all, with the uneasy hush people use for lessons learned late. Mabel survived, though Eleanor said the little horse no longer trusted new hands right away. The chestnut mare still had her cream mane and soft brown eyes, but she watched visitors from a distance before stepping forward. "She is not broken," Eleanor told me one afternoon, standing in the barn with straw on her sweater and weather in her face. "She is simply asking the world to earn her again." Then Mabel lowered her head into Eleanor's palm, and the old woman smiled through tears she did not try to hide. Harbor went home to Arthur and June Bell with a plaid blanket, a softer bed, and a new title, Honorary Neighborhood Watchman, Retired. He no longer rushed to the door. He lifted his head, listened, and let Arthur answer first. June joked that Harbor had moved from active duty to management. That old dog seemed to accept the promotion with dignity, especially when it came with toast crusts. As for Rin, he remained at the clinic until Dr. Monroe decided he was strong enough to leave. By then, he had grown just enough to fill both of my hands instead of one. His sable fur had darkened along his back, his tiny folded ears twitched in sleep, and his little paws needed the towel whenever he drank from the bottle. I signed the adoption papers on a rainy Tuesday, wearing the same coat I had wrapped around him at Willow Grace Farm. I did not call him my partner then. That would have been unfair to both of us. He was not a symbol. He was a baby. He needed milk, warmth, checkups, and someone willing to wake in the dark when his small voice called. 2 years later, on a bright training field washed with morning sun, Rin found the hardest scent marker in the final test. Applause broke out behind us, sharp and joyful. But Rin did not run to the reward toy. He turned, crossed the grass, and placed one front paw gently on the toe of my boot, exactly where his tiny paw had once pressed against my hand beneath the clinic lamp. That was the day his file changed. Rin Ward, K9 Unit. People have asked me many times when I knew Rin would become my partner. They expect me to name a case, a chase, a perfect search in bad weather, some heroic moment fit for a framed photograph. But the truth is smaller and holier than that. I knew on a foggy morning at Willow Grace Farm, before he had a name, before he had strength, before I had learned how much a heart could change inside a single investigation. A 2-week-old puppy looked at me from a wooden basket as if begging the world not to forget him. and somehow, in saving him, I began saving the best part of myself. That was the first page of the Wren Files. At the end of this story, perhaps the greatest lesson is not only that justice matters, but that kindness must be protected by wisdom. A good heart is a beautiful gift, but even the kindest people must learn to look closely, ask careful questions, and protect the quiet doors of their lives. Trust is precious, and because it is precious, it should never be handed to those who only wear goodness like a coat. Wren's story reminds us that no life is too small to matter. A tiny puppy left in the cold became the beginning of truth. An old dog named Harbor showed that love does not retire when the body grows weak. A gentle horse named Mabel taught a whole town that healing takes time, patience, and hands that know how to be kind. Animals may not speak our language, but they often show us what loyalty, courage, and forgiveness look like in their purest form. In our daily lives, we may not wear a badge or solve a case, but we all meet moments where love is tested. It may be a hungry stray near the road, an elderly neighbor who needs help carrying groceries, a lonely friend who has gone quiet, or a small act of honesty when no one is watching. Sometimes God sends us miracles wrapped in ordinary things: a paw reaching through a crate, a loyal dog at the door, a second chance after a long night, or a stranger who chooses not to look away. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder to live gently, protect the vulnerable, and never ignore the suffering of animals or people who cannot speak loudly for themselves. Share this story with someone who still believes kindness can change a life. Leave a comment and tell us about an animal that once brought light into your world. And if you want to hear more stories of loyalty, justice, healing, and hope, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, your family, and every faithful animal that has ever stood beside a human heart in need.